Tuesday, June 30th, 2020, coming at you for another edition of Cape Ann Today. Heather Atwood, we had a couple more fun interviews we want to share with the public, including, as always, a very lively chat with Erika Brown, the publisher and editor of the Manchester Cricket.
Hey guys, we've got a lot going on this week, although I felt like last week we talked about a ton. There was so much going on last week. We talked about this last week, but Manchester had its outdoor town meeting on Monday. And the weather was a little touch and go. You know, nobody knew whether it was going to pour. And, you know, Essex had its meeting and it was completely, you know, this lucky, charmed outdoor meeting with beautiful weather on a Saturday morning, right? Well, this was a Monday afternoon. And so the whole day it started getting dark and stormy and angry. And then it held off just long enough. It took place on the high school field. There were I want to say there were 214 people showed up. That's quite a lot. Mm-hmm. So we had socially distanced seating, which I think is now sort of everyone has seen those pictures of outdoor meetings and how they take place. And it was exactly right. Everything worked great. There were some small technical issues. It didn't really mean anything, but it put everybody in a great mood. So they passed everything. I wonder if that's like a strategy.
That's a great idea. Put everybody outside. Give him some fresh air.
Maybe exactly. It's exhaustion.
It's like town meeting foreplay. Yeah. Get him in the mood and boom, it all works. Yeah. So it worked. The only moment was interesting because everything passed. And I actually met with a couple people from the CPC ahead of time, and they were sort of really bracing themselves to fight for their expenditures. You know, they were all ready. And then they must have been actually disappointed that nothing happened. Just like butter. So, but really, the only thing that happened was there was a young man about 21 years old, and I know that because he's my daughter's age and he graduated with her. Nathan Evans stood up and he came forward. He went to the mic. He was a little nervous, but he said, you know, I think I want to remove the police budget line item from the budget. And I'd like to reduce it by 50%. And this was, of course, related to Black Lives Matter and the defund the police and the whole idea that we fund and resource our police departments in ways that outstrip the needs. And so therefore the police over police nationally. So these things are kind of trickling down and making their way here. His change did not pass. But I did get a letter to the editor about it from somebody as a follow-up. So this is starting. What was nice was that a woman got up and looked at everyone and said, this is a great topic of conversation, but this is not the format, this sort of out of nowhere move. Join boards. Let's start a dialogue. That was
nice response.
Yeah. The other thing we had is we're starting a series in the paper on businesses that are reopening to really shine a focused light on them, almost like a profile, to talk about what they did during the quarantine. And this week we did the Manchester Athletic Club, which a lot of people might not know what the details are about the reopenings for health clubs, which are really technically in phase, I believe it's three. However, the Manchester Athletic Club is open now. Because it does have sort of this nationally recognized competitive tennis program and tennis training chops. And tennis is one of those sports that is really good in this socially distanced lifestyle we all have. And also people who love tennis really love it. I guess one of the tennis pros sent out a text about 3 weeks ago saying they were going to be back, and she booked up all of her slots within like an hour or two. So it really shows you the popularity, and it also shows the benefit and the value of community and relationships, because, you know, the club's been around since 1973. It's a large facility. I don't know if you've been there, and they of course also have their satellite location in Gloucester, but they're back with outdoor group fitness now. So you can take sort of yoga Pilates, I think was one of their first classes back. And the owner, Anthony Simboli, told me a story about that group class that indicates sort of what's been going on. One of the members got out of that class and she had to rush out of the class. And she said, oh my God, I got to get home really fast because I want to go to online body sculpt which was a Zoom class that the club was holding. So she was running from a physical class under a tent home to take a class from her living room. So it really shows you what they've been doing. They took this downtime while other businesses sort of battened down the hatches and tried to wait out the storm. They kind of leaned in and said they had never done online classes. Now they're doing 20 a week. Their most popular class before this was something called Body Sculpt. And apparently it routinely, the basketball court, it like filled up the basketball court, and it was, no more room. Like it would max out at like 45 participants when it happened before COVID. Well, now Body Sculpt, when it's online, gets up to like 70 and even more. So imagine now that they're having this kind of merged online, offline programming. Members might be able to, you might go to a Body Sculpt class that might have 150, 250 people. That's a merging of in person for people who like the socializing, but at home for people who either want privacy or just want convenience. So that's a great example of somebody that's making lemonade out of lemons,
Well, I think this whole, the online experience could be expanding businesses in a lot of ways. It just takes sort of, as the Mac is proving, thinking it through. But I think that experience, the online classes, makes sense. I personally think driving to a place to exercise is the dumbest idea in the world. So this.
You could jog, Heather.
Well, I could. I don't think I haven't thought about it. But this is ideal for me. I actually am doing some of the online classes, and I think they're not at the Mac, but elsewhere. I might finally think about joining the Mac because I really like them. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the other ingredient that I really heard in listening to the team, and it really is a team there that's putting it all together, and they were already in this rhythm of rewarding experimentation. If there was a good idea, but way before this, they would do it, and if it didn't work, they would just move on. But so as a result, when they came into this period of time of quarantine, they just said, okay, we've never done online classes. So what? Let's try it. Let's see if people like it. And they did it within the safe environment because they suspended everybody's dues as a sort of a value, which was really nice. And now, and they just improved, gave the classes, kept the community going, and now they're back.
That's great. So you said they will be operating with 3 tents for the summer?
Three massive tents. They're massive. They're like 40 by 100, each one of them. One of them is for right now for personal training, appointments. And what's interesting, I don't want to belabor it, but remember I said that they experiment? Well, they'd already done outdoor tents. One of the head of personal training there, this guy Brendan, he had already sort of come up with an idea to have a tent, I think it was last summer, to give high school athletes a different place to work out that was all their own. So the going to a tent was like easy for them. It was automatic. They'd already tried it once before and they knew how to do it.
That's great.
Yeah. Anyway, so there you go. Next week, I'm going to do dentists.
Beautiful.
I am trying to get an appointment for a long time, so I'm anxious to hear why my dentist won't call me back. So
well, probably because he's very busy, and probably because they're working at 30% capacity because there's a lot of aspiration, like aspirating in dental work, and so they're really, really rigorous in how they handle their appointments now. It's really impressive to see how they've changed. And they too will go through this period and then come out of it in a different place, but they're in the middle of it right now.
First of all, these are two such interesting issues, right? Outdoor town meetings, basically a la the 18th century, right?
Yeah.
That's happened under COVID. And then all the issues around health clubs opening up. I happen to know a lot of people who have been really frustrated at the delay in opening up health clubs. So this is really good news. And again, innovation happening. People are innovating.
And the other thing too, moreover on the point about health clubs, are people are trying to conduct classes from home, and that's becoming more difficult as time moves on too. So it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out with the MAC and Fitness Zone and et cetera around the area. So we'll stay tuned for that. We'll keep you posted. You also had another interesting conversation with State Senator Bruce Tarr.
Yes, I did. It's again, it's always interesting to talk to him. And we discussed legislation that the Senate passed last week the Putting Patients First Act. This is healthcare legislation that has a lot of points that were born out of the COVID-19 crisis. So there were lessons learned there.
Here's Senator Tarr.
This is a very important bill, Heather, and it's one that reflects some things that we've done in the Senate in the past, but that haven't necessarily made it into law yet. But the three basic concepts of it are making sure that we have access to telemedicine for the next 2 years, making sure that we prohibit surprise billing, and I can talk a little bit about what that is, and then expanding the scope of practice for certain healthcare providers. So telemedicine sort of speaks for itself. It's the idea that we don't have to be physically in the same place with our healthcare provider. And it's been something that I've been a champion probably for at least a decade of. And we have started to see it become used. And it's truly one of those situations where I think necessity has been the mother of invention. Because of our limited mobility during the pandemic, it has become a tool that is very popular and very useful. And so what we wanted to make sure is that telemedicine can continue to be available. It's been done on an emergency basis, on an interim basis. What the Putting Patients First Act says is that it will be there in place for 2 years. Now, here's something that's really important about that. It will be there for 2 years with the reimbursement for a telemedicine visit being the same as an in-person visit to a provider. Now, over time, we should move away from that because telemedicine can save money. And so but we want to make sure that at least for 2 years, the compensation is the same so that we'll continue to have it and it won't be disrupted. So one of the amendments that I offered, and it was accepted unanimously by the Senate, is to spend those 2 years when we know it's going to be in place and look at a rate structure that's sustainable. Because we want to make sure that we pay the right amount for the right things. And if we don't do that, we're going to cause an increase in healthcare costs and healthcare premiums. So I was very pleased that we got that. And basically, we had two amendments. One says that at the end of 2 years, we're going to have a plan in place for how we pay for these different things and a rate structure. And then a year from now, we're going to get an interim report on the cost impacts of telemedicine. And because it's important that we don't just look at costs, because healthcare is about much more than that, that we also look at its impact on the quality of care and the cost effectiveness of care. And so that will happen a year out. So I feel good about those amendments.
Let me just lay this out as I think I understand it, Senator. So until COVID-19, telemedicine was not covered by insurance companies, right?
We had been working on it, but it was not. It was we authorized it and actually required it as a result of the circumstances that we were facing with the pandemic.
So these were emergency measures in response to COVID-19.
They were, but I think it's important to stress that we have been trying to do this for a while. But yes, indeed, I think what drove telemedicine being available was the pandemic.
Can I just point out, just like I've been trying to buy fish on Roger Street for a long time, it took okay?
Well, and that's actually the spirit of the bill, is that we know how valuable this is now, and we want to make sure that it continues to be available.
So this bill does seem to be sort of taking the lessons from COVID and trying to turn them into policy, right? Taking lessons from COVID.
It definitely is, and I'll give you another example of that. One of the things that happens in the bill is that we direct a state agency, well, two actually, the Health Policy Council and the Center for Health Information Analysis, and we direct them to look at what's been happening with COVID-19. And an amendment that I offered that was, again, adopted unanimously was to direct them to look at how much personal protective equipment we need and to make projections around that for the foreseeable future and to offer suggestions on how to make sure we have enough of it. So studying that is something I think is the least we can do. And I actually am planning some more legislation that goes even further than that. But at least in this bill, so far we have a study to say we can't ignore what we've just seen, because PPE became something that was a desperately needed item. And in some cases, the lack of it began to paralyze our healthcare system. So we are trying to learn the lessons of the pandemic, because we can't go through an experience like this and not learn from it and not make our healthcare system stronger.
There are a couple of other sections to the legislation. One is expanding the professional roles in healthcare. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So one of the things, again, that we've been trying to work on for a while is expanding the ability of certain practitioners to be able to practice for consumers without needing to be supervised by another practitioner. And the idea behind that is to make more services available and to give people more choices. And again, this is influenced by the pandemic, because we have had reduced mobility and reduced ability to interact. And so there are a number of different professionals that are allowed to expand their practices in this bill. And one of the things, for instance, we see is folks that are a particular type of dental hygienist that can practice without necessarily being directly supervised. So a whole host of things. I know if I begin to list them, Heather, I'm going to get them wrong. But there are a list of things that where we're saying that these folks should be able to practice independently. Some of the examples that usually come up is an optometrist being able to treat glaucoma, for instance, which is usually done with eye droplets and other kinds of things. Nothing that involves surgery or things that are complicated, but just trying to define a scope of practice that makes sense.
Well, again, as I read it, so many of these things were clearly created, this bill were clearly created in response to COVID situations. For instance, the pharmacists being included in healthcare teams. Now that seems like something that totally makes sense. And I can imagine that given a health crisis, and we had many of them in the past 3 months, suddenly Mass Health and these services were seeing how important it was to communicate with pharmacists. So I think under this legislation, pharmacists will now be included in the teams.
They can, and the shorthand way of saying that is that they can now be counted as providers in a healthcare team. And this is, again, something that pharmacists have been interested in for a very long period of time. And their argument has been that oftentimes they can enter into a partnership with a doctor and they can co-manage a patient's pharmaceutical care. And that conversation that results from that partnership can be very, very effective. And they want to be part of the treatment team. And we think that's a good idea. We think it makes a lot of sense. And that's included in the bill. I would say that this provision has been included in other bills that are making their way through the process as well. So you hit the nail exactly on the head. This is something that we've been looking at for a while, but in the era of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's taken on some new urgency.
And the last piece I think that I recognized when I was reading about this legislation is the surprise billing. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So one of the things that has been happening during the pandemic, and it happens at other times as well, is that someone may go to a healthcare provider without realizing that that provider is not in the network of their insurer. And what oftentimes happens with the so-called surprise billing is that the surprise comes when you get a bill for an out-of-network visit that you didn't expect. And that can be very disruptive to a household budget. So what we're trying to say in this bill is twofold. Number one, we're going to prohibit that. But number two, we're going to direct, again, some of the same state agencies to look at rate setting for out-of-network billing, so that we know that we can't indefinitely say that you can go outside of your insurer's network, but there should be a better way to do it than having sort of an all or nothing proposition where if you go outside the network, you get hit with a huge bill. And so I think this is a good approach to be able to look at it both ways, to say we're going to prohibit this, but we're also going to look toward a better way of saying if you go outside the network, there may be a premium for that, but it's not going to be the kind of increased premium that you would see right now.
And as I understand, a lot of healthcare providers are actually needing to close their doors. So you may find out suddenly and in an unfortunate way that your healthcare provider isn't even operating anymore. So you might turn to someone else and then find out afterward the fact that they're not in your network, right?
That's exactly the case. And that's why the pandemic, again, gave more urgency to this. It's an issue that we had been looking at, but in the era of the pandemic, you're absolutely right. Some providers haven't been available. Some have not been as available. And sometimes, again, because of limited mobility and the need for social distancing, people would go to the nearest provider or the provider that was most accessible. And so we want to make sure that there isn't a penalty for that. We want people to seek out good care, and we want them to get good care. And accessibility and affordability are two important components of good health care.
Well, this seems like a great piece of legislation to me. Do you want to add anything to this?
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with you. We hope that the House will take this up and that we can get this to the governor's desk. And it raises an important question, Heather, and that is that under the rules of the House and Senate right now, we are scheduled to end formal sessions on July 15th. And if that were the case, we would need to get this done by then, because it's very unlikely that a bill this complicated would make it through final passage in an informal session, which is what right now will happen after July 15th. But we may have a need to come back into session, certainly to do the state budget. And the question will be, will we do other things as well, if in fact we suspend the rules to come back into session?
And the state budget has been put off because of the tax, all the taxes their deadlines got changed, right?
There are two primary factors right now, and the delay in the filing deadline for a number of taxes, including the income tax, which was delayed till July 15th, is one of them. And the second very large factor is trying to understand what the federal government is going to do, because we really do need federal assistance for cities and towns and for states, because right now we're projected to have somewhere between a 6 and 8 billion with a B budget deficit for fiscal year 21, which actually begins on July 1st. But we have passed an interim budget, so there'll be no interruption in state government, state services, the meeting of state obligations. So we've gotten some additional time to do that. But one of the things we're hearing from Capitol Hill is that we may not get a clear sense of what's going to happen in terms of federal assistance until at least July 20th. And so we've been postponing consideration of an entire year's worth of budget for fiscal year 21 until we know more about those two things, and hopefully some more by the time we get that information.
Well, let's switch a little bit, pivot a little bit, this conversation, staying with the federal government. I understand that there was $28 million from the CARES Act designated for fishing industry in Massachusetts. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? We touched on it last week, and we wanted to follow up on some issues.
So I do have some more information, Heather, and one of the most exciting things, as far as I'm concerned, that's happening in state government is the development of the Massachusetts Seafood Collaborative, which we talked about a little bit when we last had a discussion. And as part of that, this week, the collaborative met virtually, and we heard from Dan McKiernan, the director of the Division of Marine Fisheries, about how the state is proposing to distribute that $28 million in CARES Act money. And basically, they're creating, Dan and his team at Division of Marine Fisheries, which includes a number of panels with folks that have expertise in different parts of the fishing industry. They're looking at different formulaic approaches. So for instance, when it comes to seafood processors, they're looking at distributing the money based on the number of employees. If you look at folks that are harvesters, are fishermen, then they're looking at maybe how many pounds you landed or how much money you would normally have generated from those landings. And then they're also looking at party and charter boats, and they'll have a third formulaic approach to how to distribute the money to them. So Division of Marine Fisheries and the Executive Office of Energy and Economic Affairs, or Energy and Environmental Affairs, I'm sorry, they're working very quickly to be able to get this money out, because it very much is intended in the nature of sort of economic disaster relief. There are other tools that we're going to be using for longer term rebuilding, but this is really money that needs to get out as quickly as possible. And it was heartening to hear this week on our collaborative meeting. And by the way, when we do these meetings, we have well over 60 fishing industry stakeholders and government officials from all across the state. And this week, we actually had folks from the U.S. Department of Agriculture on the line with us as well, from Washington. But it was very heartening to hear how much progress is being made on distributing this money in a fair and equitable way.
The $28 million is coming from the CARES Act. So NOAA is not distributing that money. The Division of Marine Fisheries is responsible for distributing this money.
Well, and there's even a third twist to this. So Division of Marine Fisheries is developing the proposal as to how it should be distributed. And my understanding is that ultimately NOAA will have to approve that. But the distribution of the funds is actually going to be managed by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, which is an interstate compact on the East Coast that deals with a lot of different issues and different species that aren't necessarily managed by the federal government. And so it looks like ASFMC, because they have experience in these kind of things, they will actually be the entity distributing the checks and accounting for the money. The proposal will be developed by Division of Marine Fisheries using federal money, and the proposal will be approved by NOAA.
This is why people get so confused when they talk about the fishing industry, is that right? So anything else you want to bring us up to date with from the State House?
So I want to let you know about a couple of things. Number one, there's a lot of momentum on Beacon Hill around police reform and racial equity. And there's a Senate working group, which I happen to be a member of, that consists of 6 members of the Senate. And we are working on legislation on this front. Also, the governor has filed a bill, and it's largely centered around something called POST, Police Officer Standards and Training, that incorporates a lot of reforms, including the certification of police officers and having standardized training across a number of different areas. And so those things are getting a lot of attention, and rightfully so. And my expectation is that over the next several weeks, you will see the House and the Senate debating legislation in that realm. And then in addition to that, we have a general government bond bill coming forward. The House has already approved it. The Senate will take it up next week, next Thursday. And one of the more notable things in that bond bill is money for food systems. And we're looking at the language right now to make sure that it's strong as it can possibly be. In the House, Representative Ferranti worked a lot on this language to make sure that we have, right now, order of magnitude $34, $35, $36 million to be able to invest in food banks and food systems and a whole host of different things. I do have to point out that, however, that it's a bond bill. So that means it's part of a 2-step process, that the legislature essentially creates an entire menu of items, but only the administration can spend money on those items. So we give a directive or set the stage, and then the administration releases the money. So not all the things that wind up in a bond bill wind up being money that gets released, but we do think it's important to have the right parameters in the bond bill for priorities, and food is definitely one of them. So we'll be taking that up next Thursday, and we'll also be taking up a supplemental budget, which is intended to cover things that we think the federal government will reimburse. So we're trying to identify all of those things that we need to spend money on, things like personal protective equipment and other kinds of things, so that if we put that bill in place and if we authorize the spending, we can leverage as much federal support as possible. So it's going to be a busy week next week on Beacon Hill.
Mm. Are you anticipating more funding coming, another round of funding from Washington?
We are, and we absolutely need it. But it's unclear right now what it's going to look like. But we need it on 2 fronts. We need it to support the kind of things that I just mentioned, but we also need it in the form of assistance directly to the states and to the cities and towns. A lot of the money that's been released thus far has been for particular things, but has not been generally in the nature of a block granting of money. And that's the kind of thing we really need now to be able to help balance the state budget. As we've talked about in the past, we have a very robust stabilization fund. It's $3.5 billion in Massachusetts, but against a potential shortfall of $6 to $8 billion, it isn't as large as it might otherwise appear. So we really hope that we're going to get federal assistance to help balance the budget for next year, because we also know that the following year may not be an easy one as well.
Right. And then the governor, I believe, touched upon schools opening up in the fall and all the costs associated with that we haven't even begun to address as a state, right?
We have not. And in fact, yesterday, the governor and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education released guidance for the reopening of schools in the fall. And one of the things that is in the guidance, among many, is a requirement of the use of PPE for educators and for students. Now, with regard to students, the guidance generally says that parents will be responsible for providing masks, for instance, but schools will be providing it for educators and administrators. And that's a significant cost that schools don't usually have to bear. So part of what got released yesterday is an announcement that there'll be $200 million to get started to be able to cover those costs for schools. And in rough numbers, the guidance indicates that it could be about, or as much as, $225 per student for eligible expenses. So I would suggest that we're just at the tip of that iceberg, and as we move forward, we're probably going to find there's more need than that. But it at least is a recognition that, yes, we're going to have a new set of rules. It's not going to be school the way that it was before. There are some costs that we're going to have to acknowledge and address as part of that.
Well, what are you proudest of this week, Senator Tarr?
Well, that is a great question, Heather, and thank you for it. I am proudest of the fact that the legislature yesterday was able to work together in a bipartisan way to consider 70 amendments and produce a healthcare bill that has tremendous potential to help people gain access and cost effectiveness, and to not be destabilized by the cost of unforeseen bills regarding healthcare. So there are many things that I've been proud of this past week, but that is certainly, I think, along the top of the list.
Again, just catching up with that legislation, it was passed in the Senate and it goes on to the House. So we will follow up with you and let everyone know how that legislation goes. But I think there's some really interesting points in it, particularly this telemedicine point.
Mm-hmm. So that is your Tuesday, folks. We'll be back with you tomorrow once again. Beth Pocock of Sawyer Free Library talks about the Gloucester Reads program, and Mike Chapman of the Elder Brethren of Manchester speaks with us too. That group's been in existence for 143 years. Find out how they do things differently. All right, we'll see you Wednesday. Have a great Tuesday night.